Wife's terminally ill ex used his dying wish for a picnic with her, leaving me torn between Compa-sion and confusion. My name is Mark, and my wife, let's call her Susan, and I have been happily married for 8 years. Our history together goes even further back, all the way to our days in a church choral group, when Susan was actually dating a guy named Ken. The three of us quickly became close friends, sharing music, laughter, and the feeling that some friendships might last forever. To be honest, I always assumed that Susan and Ken were destined to marry or at least stay together for a very long time. That's why it blindsided me when Susan came to me one day in total shock. She and Ken had broken up. According to her, Ken had out of nowhere told her he planned to move interstate. When she naturally asked why he would suddenly leave, he offered no explanation. The very next day, he hit her with, "Do you want to come too?" Still processing everything, Susan said no. Of course she did, she had her life and work and commitments here. That was all Ken needed. He immediately ended things and disappeared from her life, leaving Susan deeply hurt and completely bewildered. Some time after their breakup, a mutual friend confided in me that Ken had been planning this for months and had really left to be with someone else in that new city. But even then, it was just speculation based on texts, nothing concrete. To this day, Susan never got real closure. Whenever anyone asked why things ended between them, she'd shrug and repeat for the 100th time, "I don't know. He broke up with me because I wouldn't move interstate with him." It was like a riddle with no answer. Eventually, as years rolled by and the sting faded, Susan and I grew closer. Our friendship turned into something real and lasting, and we built the life we share now. But yesterday, all that ancient history came rushing back. Out of nowhere, Susan's phone lit up with a call from Ken's mother. She's a kind woman, supportive of our music and a familiar face at church events and every holiday season, but we rarely see her, maybe once or twice a year. Never once had she called us at home. Her voice sounded strained as she explained why she was reaching out. Ken is terminally ill. He's been in the hospital interstate for a while, and now, through a little Make-A-Wish style program at the hospital, Ken's one request is to go on a picnic in the national park with Susan. I'll admit, at first, the whole thing sounded bizarre. Was it real, or was I being played? I double-checked with Ken's mom, and she agreed that the entire situation felt odd, but she just wanted us to know. She was only relaying Ken's wish and stressed that Susan was under no obligation to say yes. The reality of Ken's prognosis is grim. We have no idea how much time he has left, so if any decision is going to be made, it probably has to be soon. Susan was floored. Why her, after all this time? Why now, after what he put her through? She confessed that she didn't want anything to do with Ken after that heartbreak, but part of her couldn't shake the guilt of saying no to a dying man's last wish. With a half-hearted laugh, she tried to lighten the mood, joking, "Well, you don't have to worry about me cheating, he's going to die anyway." Dark humor, but I got her point. And me? I'm lost in thought. I trust Susan. I know nothing romantic would come from this if she agreed to see Ken. But I just don't get it. What's Ken really looking for? Is this about closure? That's the only explanation that halfway makes sense to me. The outing would probably be supervised anyway, with a hospital volunteer on hand, so nothing weird could happen. But why focus his dying wish on Susan? Why not wish for something bigger, or to see family? I guess I can't help putting myself in Ken's shoes. If I were dying and hoped to see someone important from my past only to have them refuse, would that crush me even more as my last memory? I keep turning the question over in my mind. Should we honor this request and give Ken his day with Susan, or should we say no? I don't want to let guilt be the only factor in the decision, but I also can't deny the gravity of a dying man's wish. I can't stop thinking about what the right thing to do is, for Ken, for Susan, and for us. Update 1. After my wife managed to get in touch with Ken's mom, we were able to dig for more answers and clarification. The conversation really opened up a lot. Ken's mom only heard about his plan to meet with Susan yesterday. That surprised her. There hadn't been a word about it throughout Ken's entire hospital stay. Lately, Ken has been reaching out to plenty of old friends, especially from high school. His mom sees this as a kind of blanket attempt to reconcile with many people from his past. Curious, we asked if she remembered anything specific, or if Ken had ever mentioned anything about the breakup with Susan. Susan was the one who wanted to know. Ken's mom said honestly, she didn't even find out the two of them had split up until a couple of weeks after the fact. But she did share one striking insight. Ken always felt like there was nothing much for him to do in the state he was originally from, the state all of us are still in. He wanted something different. She suspects he might have jumped the gun, accepted a job offer way too quickly without ever consulting Susan, and he didn't, and panicked when it hit him that Susan wasn't ready to move. Ken never admitted any of this directly. He and his mom aren't especially close, but in her view, that's the likely root of their breakup. Susan agreed that this explanation made a lot of sense, but she also pointed out that it still wasn't a great way to handle things. Ken never actually told her he was unhappy with their living situation, and that stung. Even though Ken found success in his new job, it turned out to be a nest of stress. He started using weed, alcohol, and smoking heavily. It was tough to hear that those choices have contributed to his current illness. It's now been confirmed that, should Ken go outside the hospital grounds, a medical volunteer will accompany him. His balance is worsening, and according to his mom, It's very likely he'll need a wheelchair soon. Curious about the meeting spot, we pressed, why did Ken want to see Susan in a park? His mom had no clue. It seems to just be what he wanted. Ken was happy for me to come along with Susan to the park or wherever the meeting ends up taking place. He's also fine with us seeing him in the hospital, but right now, only 2 visitors are allowed per day. That complicates things since his mom wants to be there every day to help him with baths and daily living, so if Susan and I both showed up at the same time, she might miss a chance to care for him. We floated the idea of a Skype or phone call as an alternative, but Ken was hesitant. His mom told us his speech is quite slurred now, and since he hasn't been eating or drinking much, his mouth is dry and talking is uncomfortable most days. Writing a letter isn't an option either. The meds make him drowsy and sedated, so he struggles to write and even dictating would be tough. Some days, Ken's mom helps him type emails to friends, but not much more than that. There's also a chance that Ken could be transferred to his mother's house for end-of-life care if it comes to that. Ken's mom was clear about one thing: Susan is completely free to turn down this offer, especially with everything going on in the world right now. She'd absolutely understand if Susan couldn't make it. But she hoped we'd consider it, for her son's sake. After that conversation, my wife and I felt more inclined to go see him instead of declining. We're staying in touch with Ken's mom to keep up with the situation as it develops. Susan and I did our own little risk assessment and agreed that, honestly, this seemed pretty harmless. Susan admitted she still feels pretty apathetic toward Ken, but also said she'd feel bad if she didn't go, especially now that Ken and his mom have welcomed both of us to visit together. So, with everything out on the table, we're going. Update 2. After getting back from running errands, Susan and I sat down to talk again about everything going on. The conversation kept circling back to Ken, so we decided to reach out to a couple of friends from our choral group. It turns out one of them already knew that Ken was unwell, but they had no idea it was this serious. Apparently no one really talks about Ken much in the group these days because both Susan and I are still involved. The depth of Ken's illness has been kept a closely guarded secret. Almost nobody outside his family seems to know how bad things are. Susan looked at me and said it feels like she actually has the power to make Ken's final days a bit easier. She told me she wants to visit him. She wants me there with her too. We agreed that if there's anything he wants to say, we'll be there to listen, and that would be the end of it. We have no clue what the actual logistics of all this will look like or when it will happen. Naturally, it will require some coordination with Ken's family, and of course, Ken himself, depending on his condition. Everything feels fragile right now, but once we finally do meet him, I promise to share what happens, because it definitely feels like a situation where every moment counts. We reached out to our group, texting the other choral members and suggesting that maybe, if the time comes and when circumstances allow, we could all visit him together. Everyone responded so enthusiastically and said they'd love the chance to send him off with one last song, specifically the Irish Blessing. The idea felt just right for Ken. When Ken's mom mentioned this Make-A-Wish style foundation, I know some people think of the traditional version that's only for kids, but this is something the local hospital offers, run entirely by volunteers, and only available for those in end-of-life care. I'm fairly sure it has an official name, but Ken's mom used Make-A-Wish to make things simple. As for the setting at the park, I honestly have no idea why he chose that. Maybe when you're that sick the location doesn't matter as much, and I've seen that reflected in how flexible Ken's been about changing venues and including me. This whole story has left me with so many strange feelings, but if I'm honest, that's why it seemed worth sharing in the first place. If Ken had messaged Susan out of the blue, perfectly healthy and asking her to meet him alone at the park, both of us would have said hell no. But now, with everything out in the open and knowing about his condition after speaking with his mom, and seeing that he's reached out to more people, it just feels more complicated. A bittersweet, poignant moment that somehow pulled us all back together. Update 3. Anyway, I wanted to share an update for anyone curious about how everything turned out with Ken and Susan. The meeting actually went really well, much better than I was anticipating. After a couple of reschedules, my wife and I drove to the hospital earlier this week to see Ken and his mom. We got there pretty early, around 8 a.m. Ken's mom often stays with him overnight, so we'd timed it just right for her to hand Ken over to us and finally get some rest herself. Someone suggested we bring her a care package, so we did, a simple box filled with a couple pairs of warm socks, moisturizer, books, and toiletries. The moment we handed it to her, she burst into tears. It was a small gesture, but it clearly meant the world to her. My wife and I went in together and did a little catch-up with Ken. The conversation was a slow process because Ken couldn't really speak for too long at a time, so everything had to be broken up into little sections. I asked Ken if he'd like to spend some time alone with Susan, and he nodded yes, so I stepped out for a while. I took a walk, did a bit of remote work on my laptop, and just told Susan to text me if she needed anything. I ended up being gone for a couple of hours before Susan messaged me to come back up. During this time, Susan had the conversation she'd really come for. She asked Ken, what happened? Why did he move out of state so suddenly, and was there some hidden motive behind it? Ken finally opened up and the story unfolded. Ken told her that at the time he was working a low-paying job and felt stuck, like there was never going to be any real chance for career progression. Susan and I both knew Ken had always been creative. He got a diploma in film and everything, but what we hadn't known was that, behind everyone's back, he was applying for jobs in the film and animation industry. He put in an application just for fun, not expecting anything to come of it, but a few months later he actually landed a position as an intern animator. He was thrilled, but the offer blindsided him. He admitted he never planned for it, simply because he felt sure he'd never get picked. The job required him to move interstate immediately, and he just felt pressured. He'd applied for roles like this before and always been rejected, so this time he figured he couldn't pass up the opportunity. He asked Susan to move with him but left out the crucial details about the job. As an intern, he was going to be earning even less than his old low-wage job, with a lot of the work being voluntary. He was scared Susan would never agree to move with him under those circumstances, so he left that part out and just asked her to move. He admitted it was stupid, and he apologized for being immature about the whole thing. After they broke up, he spent a few months working as an intern and quickly discovered the reality of the industry. It was brutal, tons of mandatory crunch time, to the point where he and the other interns were basically living in the office, sometimes even sleeping there, while huge files compiled. The pressure was relentless. At some point, Ken started drinking to cope, since everyone in the office did. Eventually, the social drinking turned severe. Alcohol led to smoking and then to drugs. Ken stuck with it and eventually became a technical lead, but he said he had zero social life or support except for a couple of colleagues. His only support was this small group that just went out for drinks. That just made things worse. His substance abuse escalated, and he ended up in and out of the hospital with alcohol poisoning. He never sought any real help for himself. He suspects he was depressed, but between rent and his drinking habits, he was barely scraping by, even as his job title improved. He admitted to making other terrible decisions along the way, some so wild they'd be popcorn worthy if I had the time to go into them. He got arrested, lost jobs, had to bounce from one place to another. It just kept piling up. When Susan asked about the infamous park incident, Ken said he meant no harm. He was just desperate to get outside, sick of being cooped up in the hospital with no hope of going out for real. And that's really where things stand. Ken's substance abuse is what led him here. I got to catch up with him too, a bit of reminiscing about the old days when we all used to hang out together. I joke that it's hard to see anyone these days with COVID restrictions. Ken told me some of his old school friends had also come to visit, and it meant a lot that people still cared. He tried reaching out to a former girlfriend to apologize, but only Susan showed up. He had other relationships after her, but none turned up. He told me he was sad about that, but he wanted to tie up loose ends while he still had time left. I ended up asking him about his prognosis. He said he didn't know, but there were plans for him to continue end-of-life care at home, which he prefers. When we left Ken, I asked Susan what she thought about it all. She told me she felt so much better having spoken to him and hearing the truth. She relayed the whole story to me again as we were driving home, cursing and shaking her head at the trouble he'd gotten himself into. I can't believe he did that. What a dumb person, she said more than once. So for anyone wondering if there's a chance Susan might go back to Ken, let me be clear, it's not going to happen. I checked in with her the next day to see how she was feeling, and honestly, she'd pretty much put it all behind her already. Her only lingering concern was for Ken's mom. She just hoped she'd be able to cope, since she's genuinely a good person. Susan looks a lot less guilty these days, so I'm grateful we went. Since then, we haven't really talked about Ken much. We've just focused on work and making plans for our upcoming road trip. If there's anything to take away from this, it's that people need to seek help if they're struggling. Even in uncertain times, little acts of kindness can make a huge difference. I'm glad I was able to be there for someone who once meant a lot to both me and Susan. Update 4. Ken's mom called late on a Tuesday night to say the hospital had fast-tracked his transfer to her place and he'd been pushing all afternoon to get outside while he still could. The volunteer coordinator said they could make it happen if we kept it short and close to the car park. We picked the smallest, flattest bit of the national park, more of a clearing than a hike, and met them there the next day just before lunch. It was cool, thin sunlight, the sort of weather where your breath shows up in little clouds and the thermos suddenly becomes the hero of the day. They brought him in a transport van with a nurse and a volunteer. Ken had an oxygen cannula and one of those gray hospital blankets tucked around his legs. He looked shocked by the air, eyes wide, taking small sips like the sky was a drink. Susan squeezed his shoulder and he smiled in this lopsided way that made him look like the kid we knew from choir for half a second. We laid out a picnic rug no one ended up sitting on, poured tea, and opened a container of cut fruit that turned into more of a show and tell than a meal. He pointed at a slice of mango like it was something he'd forgotten existed. He didn't have enough breath for long stories. Everything came in little bursts. He asked if we'd mind if it was quiet for a bit. So we sat and watched a couple of kids fly a kite that kept threatening to dive bomb their dad. A dog in a ridiculous sweater tried to befriend everybody. It wasn't the grand, cinematic reconciliation I'd pictured in my head. It was low-key, almost awkward, and exactly right. At one point he took Susan's hand and whispered, "Can I ask for a song?" He wanted the Irish blessing, of course he did. Susan laughed because she always does when she's nervous, and then she just sang. Softly, like you do when you're not in a church and you don't want to scare the birds. I came in on the harmony I've done 100 times. Halfway through the first verse, I noticed two of our choir friends standing a little way off the path. Ken's mom had messaged them, I found out later. They didn't come up or make a thing of it, they just stood back and floated the tenor line in. If you've ever heard four voices come together outside, with the wind turning pages for you, you'll know what I mean when I say it felt like the air shifts shape around the notes. Ken closed his eyes and leaned into it like you lean into a hammock. He'd brought something. His mom fished around in her tote and handed Susan a tiny black USB on a red lanyard. Ken said, "Last thing I finished. 3 minutes. The file's called Practice Room." He wanted us to keep it, and he asked if we could show it to the choir one day when it made sense. He apologized for not getting to make it better. He kept repeating that phrase, make it better, like it was the thing that had chased him his whole adult life. Susan promised we'd do right by it. We didn't get an hour. Maybe 45 minutes, and even that felt like we were stealing from his reserves. The nurse watched his oxygen numbers and finally gave us the look. Before we packed up, Ken asked if we could drive past the church on the way back, just to see it. The nurse shrugged and said if we stayed in the van, it was fine. I rang our music director on the off chance someone would be around. He said, "Give me 15. When we rolled up to the curb, there were 8 of them on the front steps, spaced out, scarves and beanies, hymnals tucked under elbows. No speeches. They just lifted their heads and sang the Amen, those 3 little chords that feel like putting your hand on a warm radiator." Ken cried with no sound, the way little kids do when they're out of breath from running. The nurse cracked the van window and the sound slipped in sideways. He tapped a beat on his blanket with 2 fingers. When they finished, he mouthed "thank you" and tried to clap, then laughed at himself for not pulling it off. Back at his mom's, we helped get him inside. By helped, I mean we carried the thermos and kept doors open while the actual professionals did the important bits. His mom pressed an envelope into Susan's hand in the hallway. "He wrote this back then," she said. "He found it in a box a few days ago. He never posted it. It was thin and soft from being handled too much. We didn't read it in their house. We went around the corner and sat in the car with the heater on until our windows fogged. It wasn't a declaration or anything dramatic. It was just Ken at 20-something, in bad handwriting, trying to be brave and failing at it. He'd written that he was scared he'd end up small if he stayed, and then he wrote that he knew he'd made her feel small by keeping her out of the truth. "I wanted to be the kind of man who builds a thing and invites you into it," he'd written, "and instead I built a secret and dragged you to the door." There was a childish sketch in the corner of 2 stick figures in a choir loft, one with big hair that looked nothing like Susan's and somehow exactly like her. That night he took a turn. Fluid, a fever, all the phrases you never want attached to someone's name. We went back the next afternoon. He was foggier, drifting in and out, but there was a moment when he opened his eyes and saw us and scrunched up his face in that lopsided grin. He whispered, "Did you watch it?" We hadn't, not yet. We told him we wanted to watch it properly, with the speakers turned up and not on my phone in a hospital corridor. He seemed pleased by that. He said, "Make it better one more time," then coughed and the nurse came in and that was the end of that conversation. We watched Practice Room that night at our kitchen table with the lamp off. He'd animated the 3 of us in that tiny rehearsal space at the back of the church, the crooked music stands, the old Yamaha keyboard with the middle C sticky, the scuffed floor. It wasn't literal, it was looser than that. Colored lines that found each other and flickered into shape when the pitches locked in, a pencil tracing a laughing mouth and erasing it and trying again, a metronome that learned to breathe. It was rough in places, you could see where the frames got away from him, but there's a shot where the camera lifts up and you look down on 3 dots of light that pulse in time and then ease into a shape that is not a triangle, not quite, but something you only recognize by feel. At the end, he'd tucked in a line of text, small and white, for the ones who kept time when I didn't. I sent a message to our director and we made a plan. We went back one more time, all of us standing in his mom's driveway at dusk, spaced out again, cold enough to see your breath. She set her phone in the window and put us on speaker so he could hear. We sang The Parting Glass because he'd asked for that one when we were kids and never got the chance to do it in a service. A neighbor across the street came out with a cup of tea and stayed for the last verse. Ken didn't come to the window. The nurse said he was listening from bed. On the final "Good night and joy be with you all," the porch light blinked twice. His mom didn't move for a long time after we finished. When she finally waved, it wasn't at us so much as at the space we'd left in the air. Update 5. Ken died a little before dawn on Friday. His mom called while the kettle was still thinking about boiling, and she didn't say the word, she just said, "He's quiet now," and then you could hear the nurse in the background closing curtains with that soft, decisive sound fabric makes. Susan and I drove over with the kind of errands you can do without being asked: bananas, milk, patience. The house had that hushed, rearranged look where everything has been moved half an inch to make room for equipment and there are still paper wristbands on the coffee table. His mom kept smoothing a throw pillow that didn't deserve it, then put her hand on the transport van paperwork like that could keep it from blowing away even though there was no breeze and we were indoors. When the funeral director finally came, she went into the bedroom and asked for 5 more minutes and came back with a little black USB on the red lanyard looped around her wrist like a bracelet. We didn't go back to work. We went to the church. The music director pretended he was already there by coincidence and then admitted he had been waiting in his car with a takeaway coffee since 7 because he thought we might come. We took the old Yamaha out of the rehearsal room like we were rolling an old friend into the light. Middle C is still sticky. I set my laptop on the back pew and we plugged the USB in like it was some kind of sacrament. There were 2 folders we hadn't seen before because they were tucked inside a .prefix directory that my Mac had been hiding. Takes and Loft. Inside Loft were 5 tiny video files shot on an ancient phone, shaky, thin sound, a loop of someone, Ken, panning past our faces in the old practice room while we sang something dumb and cheerful on a Wednesday night 10 years ago. The camera keeps catching the light on Susan's hair and the music stand leg that had tape on it because once it bit someone. The third clip is just the metronome, a blur, ticking. He'd kept them like pebbles in a pocket. We called one of his old colleagues. When I say called, I mean I sent a message to a guy whose name Ken had mentioned once, and then he rang from a kitchen you could tell had those giant city windows. He said, "You're going to want to drop the phone footage under the animation at 50% opacity and don't fix the wobble, it's doing something for you." He stayed on the line, no charge, while we re-rendered. Every now and then he'd say, "Leave that," when I got itchy to clean a rough edge. We asked him if he'd known Ken's line, "Make it better," and he laughed once and said, "Yeah." We'd say it when the client walked away, and then he said, "Softer," he meant it different. Our director found an ancient mini camcorder in the AV cupboard, silver and dead. We just held it anyway. It felt like the right weight for the afternoon. We didn't make a big plan for the service because there wasn't enough room in the day for a big plan. His mom wanted it small. We propped the projector on a folding table and aimed it at the blank wall behind the choir loft. Someone put the lanyard over the music stand. The hospital volunteer who had been at the park showed up out of uniform, hair down, and sat where you could see the vanished stains on the carpet from the time the palm fronds tried to baptize themselves. The neighbor who'd brought a cup of tea to the driveway came too and stood in the side aisle with the quiet confidence of someone who knows the exit plan. We sang the amen to warm up, because you always do, and the blower on the organ coughed once like an old hound and then settled into a purr. Susan's voice had the glassy shine it gets when she's holding something together and choosing to win. We played practice room. We didn't talk it up. The room went dark except for the spill from the vestibule, and then there they were, colored lines coming together and missing each other and trying again, and beneath them, in the faintest ghost of a layer, the jitter of real bodies in that narrow room where the keyboard was always in the way and somebody's water bottle rolled under a chair at the worst moment because the floor isn't even. Ken had laid in a low sound bed I hadn't noticed at our kitchen table. The metronome, yes, but also the heater clicking, and that breath you take when you don't mean to and the whole cord lifts around it. At 2 minutes 16 there was a judder where his computer must have hiccuped when he exported it. Everything skips, then aligns, then you see the dots of light flare brighter like they were unbothered by the stumble. The line at the end was still small and white, but he'd added underneath, in even smaller text, "If you have time, add your voices." We were already singing by then. Not loudly. Just under it, like you hum to a baby you don't want to wake. Afterwards there wasn't applause. It wasn't that kind of thing. His mom stood up and told a story about Ken as a kid drawing on takeaway napkins because paper was never where he was when he needed it, and then she found the words "thank you" and handed them out, like cups of water to anyone within reach. We took the lanyard off the stand and put it around her neck because none of us could stand seeing it alone on the wood. She put her hand to it the way people touch a pendant that says something. The burial was quiet. He was cremated. That sentence is so practical it makes me a little angry. On the way home we stopped at the tiny, flat bit of the national park where we'd done the not-quite picnic. It was colder, and the kids with the kite weren't there, the kite-shaped cloud was. We didn't lay out the rug. We poured hot tea into the air and watched it smoke. Susan looped the red lanyard around the low branch of a scribbly gum and then immediately took it back off because it felt wrong to leave it for Weather to chew. Instead she put it in the glove compartment like you do with a map you know you're going to need again, even if you don't know what for yet. Back at home, we opened the last folder on the USB. There was a text file addressed to me by name, which felt like tripping on your own step in the dark and catching yourself on the newel post you've never noticed in your life. It wasn't long. He wrote, "I always assumed you'd stick. You did. Thank you for being the grown-up in the room. Please don't let her carry my fear." He used my full name, which made it sound like we were in trouble. At the bottom he'd pasted a link to a private drive with a permission that pinged my email like it was asking, "Are you sure you want this?" In it were other half-finished things, loops and pencil tests and a second cut of practice room where he'd tried a version with a choir that isn't anybody, just vowels shaped into light. We will give that to the choir when it makes sense. We will make it better, not by fixing it, but by keeping it moving. We went back to his mom's that night because empty houses hum in a way that convinces you you're hearing someone call from the next room. We made her an omelet that turned into scrambled eggs and she didn't care. On the way out, the porch light flickered twice again, but this time you could see the nurse inside with her elbow brushing the switch as she moved a lamp to vacuum under it, and we both laughed because of course it was something as simple and human as that. Joy be with you all. We'll carry it. Update 6. The email turned up at 3:17 a.m. like a moth at the porch bulb. Subject line: practice room. Okay to show? The sender field said Ken, but the footer had one of those little notes that gives the trick away. Scheduled send, a future timestamp he must have set on a night when he still had nights. He wrote 3 sentences, no apologies, just permission in plain language and a line that felt like him. If you have time, Add your voices. He attached a second link I hadn't seen in the drive before with a folder called stems. Dry piano, the heater click, a metronome that wasn't absolutely on. He'd left us tracks like ingredients. We went to the church before work and cracked the place open like a thermos, warmth where you didn't expect it at that hour. The director did that thing where he pretends he just happened to be driving past with a coil of XLRs, and then he put the coil down next to the old Yamaha like he'd been practicing exactly that gesture. Middle C is still sticky. The blower on the organ coughed, cleared its throat, and sat in the corner humming like a dog that knows it's not the start today. We pulled the portable screen across the back wall of the loft, taped paper over the exit sign because the green was making the lines in the animation go mint, and set the red lanyard on the music stand because it felt wrong to leave it in the glove compartment for this. We recorded in little pieces. Susan in the back also her S's didn't bounce off the wood, me in the third pew to the right where the floor dips and swallows footsteps. The furnace kicked in once and we left it. It matched the heater click in his sound bed like two strangers finding out they're cousins. The choir trickled in as people do, coats slung over the ends of pews, someone carrying a vacuum they forgot to put away after Sunday like it was an instrument. We sang the vowel pad under the animation with the projector spilling color over our hands and the metronome being just enough wrong to make the whole chord breathe. It felt like the room was helping. When we finished, nobody said again. We just stood there and let our shoulders drop at exactly the same moment. We followed the man with the kitchen windows advice and didn't fix what didn't want fixing. He called from the city and watched our timeline through the camera on my laptop like a doctor checking a scan. Leave that, he kept saying, and sometimes, don't chase the wobble. He asked for a clean export and then sent back a pass with color that didn't make a fuss and titles that tucked themselves into corners. He said there was a festival 2 suburbs over, a shorts night in an old cinema where the carpet smelled like popcorn even in the morning, and would we mind if he put our name in for the program? I said we didn't have a name, and he said, you do now, and typed practice room, with voices. The cinema had that tilt where every seat feels like a decision. We took the middle row because we are middle row people. The screen had a scratch in the bottom left corner that made every film look like it had a shooting star in it, no extra charge. The audience was the usual beautiful mess, teenagers with skateboards awkwardly propped onto their ankles, 2 women with identical silver hair and a shared scarf, a dad with a baby asleep in the orientation they call ? Our slot was third after a stop motion about bread and a documentary about a guy who collects broken umbrellas. When the metronome ticked, you could feel the theater relax by degrees the way bodies do when they recognize a pattern. People didn't applaud when it ended because it didn't end like that. It just made space and then the space filled with the sound of programs being folded in half. We won a prize we didn't know existed, which is the best kind, an envelope with audience written on the front and a voucher inside that said the name of a local art grant as if it were the name of a friendly dog. The kitchen window man clapped once like a person who doesn't usually clap and then disappeared to the lobby with a look on his face like he was going to cry and didn't want to be seen. The MC said something about applying to lantern nights in the city and I nodded like I knew what that was. We took the envelope back to the church and put it under the lanyard on the music stand until Ken's mom could come by and decide. She didn't even look at the amount, she said, the volunteers, and that was that. We matched it because it felt better to be even. With the grant a technician came one Tuesday to tune the old Yamaha, a woman with forearms like someone who has opened a lot of stubborn jars. She ran a felt strip under the keys and frowned at middle C like it had cut her off in traffic. There's something under here, she said, and levered the key up with a tiny, beautiful tool that looks like a thing you'd find in a dentist's pocket. There was. It wasn't a coin or a screw. It was the corner of a photocopied warm-up scale, ripped off where the copier had eaten it, folded until it remembered how to be small, wedged under the felt. It had one line of handwriting in heavy pencil, almost invisible where the graphite had sunk into the paper over years of heat and cold. It said, leave the wobble. The technician looked at us over the keyboard and said, friend of yours? And we both nodded like we were in trouble and she was the principal. We started the road trip we'd been threatening to take since before all of this had a shape. We took the lanyard with us not because it was necessary but because it sits in your hand like a handle to something you can't carry any other way. We drove the long way, late fruit stalls, one of those wind farms that makes the horizon look like a choreography note in the margin. In the city we met the man with the kitchen windows and the kind of cafe where the coffee is serious and the chairs aren't. He brought us a plant in a jam jar. We cut this off the pothos from his desk. It wants to live, he said, and he was right. Even in the car on the trip home the stem threw a new leaf like a flag. He told us Ken had kept a notebook by the kettle where he wrote down sentences he thought he'd use one day. He read one out, the line learns the singer, and then laughed because there's corny and then there's true and often they shake hands. We took the plant home and put it on the windowsill above the piano. It tilted towards the light as if it knew where it was supposed to go. We set up a small screen in the rehearsal room and played the film there in the place it knew best. People came on their way to other obligations. Someone in scrubs with a lunchbox and a plastic fork jammed in the side. Someone in a suit with the jacket off and the tie stuffed in a pocket. A boy I didn't recognize sat in the back with a skateboard across his knees. He turned out to be the kid with the kite from the park minus the kite plus a haircut. He didn't say much. When the 3 dots of light did their almost triangle and then changed their minds, he wiped his face with his sleeve and said, that part, to nobody in particular. We sent the stems to the hospital volunteer coordinator and she wrote back to say they'd like to use it to start their evenings when they train new helpers, plug in the projector, dim the lights, and show people what it looks like to hold half a breath for someone else without making a headline out of it. She asked for a line to put on a plaque. We gave her for the ones who kept time when I didn't, and then spent an uncomfortable 20 minutes talking about fonts like that mattered when of course it does to some people, and that's how the world gets itself dressed. The last thing is small and lives in my pocket now. The funeral envelope came with a stub, a ticket half that says admit one even though it's done admitting anyone. It was stuck to the back of the certificate from the festival like a shy twin. I found it when I was clearing the glove compartment and the lanyard slid forward like it wanted to see daylight. I keep the stub behind my health insurance card because I like the idea that an usher somewhere will take my name and not worry about the rest. We sang the Amen last night in an empty church and it made the same 3-chord warmth it always makes. The technician had fixed middle C, but it still takes its time like an old friend at a doorway saying goodbye properly. We're not going to sand the rough edges off the film, or the keyboard, or the story. He told us not to. We'll leave the wobble. We'll keep time. And when the plant throws a new leaf, we'll point at it like it's a thing we somehow invented and laugh because of course it isn't, and somehow it is.